In this video, we're going to look at sort of the basics of what Darwin, what his ideas were, what he came up with, his idea of evolution via natural selection. Remember in the last video, we kind of talked about who Darwin was and what journey he went on and how it started to shape his thinking. Now we'll look at what the results are. In class, one of the things that we'll do is, if we were, in a large group, is we would get into small groups and we'd say, all right, so we're going to pretend that we've got a natural disaster that's occurred. Doesn't matter what it is, but the whole point is that Solana Beach, where we live here in the Solana Beach, where the school is, that it has now been split off from California and really the rest of the world, and now it's a group of small islands. And the things I want us to think about here is we've got a limited food supply. In other words, we have, just sort of imagine, a few miles radius from where the school is. That's all we've got. So whatever shopping centers and things and stores, homes, once all that food's gone, that's it. It's not, there's no magical place where food's just going to appear from. That's what we have to work with. You also have to understand that there's no mechanized transportation, out really is the big thing. Like there's nowhere to go. There's nobody that's going to be coming in and parachuting food. Imagine essentially these islands, it's like we're the only land on the planet. We're all that's left. So there's no help coming and there's no way to get out to somewhere else. And then the main thing I want us to think about too is, don't think about weapons. I don't want this whole the exercise to turn into different ways that people could kill each other. Okay, so my main focus for you then is just to think, what would happen? What I want you to think about, I want your predictions to be what's going to happen to the population immediately, in the next year, what's going to happen to the population. Then I want you to think about what's going to happen to the population over the next 100 years. And, I'd give the group some time to discuss. So maybe pause the video, think about it. And one thing I also want you to think about is I want you to do a graph, and the graph that I want you to make, I want it to look something like this. I want you to have population on the y-axis, and I want you to have time in years on the x-axis. And I want you to think, what's that graph going to look like of the population of the Solana Beach area over time? Again, in that short term, and then over the very long term, the next 1,000 years. So again, pause the video, do that. Let's take a look at what most groups kind of, the consensus typically ends up being when we do this kind of a thought experiment in class. Initially, most people, most groups, argue that things are going to get really bad in the near future. That, right after this happens, there's just going to be mass panic. You're going to run out of food and water and all those essentials very quickly. Anybody that's on certain medications to survive is going to have a major problem because the supply of those medications is very finite. And so initially, most groups kind of accept the idea that the population is going to drop dramatically in the very near future. And I want us to not only draw something that looks like that, but I also want you to label that what this is called a population crash. So most groups argue that, in the near future, you're going to have a much smaller population. But most groups will also argue that, while this time of bad is really bad, eventually it kind of tapers out and things sort of slow down to a more kind of manageable lifestyle. And then most groups actually will argue that then over time, the population will actually kind of go back up. Maybe not all the way back to where it started, maybe not as high there, but, certainly much better than it is during this period of time. Now, one thing I want us to label here is that what's going on here is a period of adaptation. And one way I want you to kind of think about that is think about how people are living here and think about how people are living here. Probably, if you think about how they compare, probably pretty dramatically different. For example, take something like Mr. Boss. So right now in today's society, my skill set, what I know how to do as an adult is I can teach, 14 and 15-year-olds about how biology works. And that's a fairly valuable skill set. It allows me to, pay my bills and support my family and, put food on the table and all that kind of stuff. But in this world, that's not a super useful skill set. Not being able to do the things I need to be able to do to survive is going to be a challenge. The fact that I have glasses is a challenge, right? Because as soon as they break, I can't see. That's a problem. The skills that are actually valuable in this world are the skills of being able to start a fire, being able to fish and clean fish, and being able to hunt, and maybe knowing the basics of how to grow plants and those kinds of things. And so what's going to happen here during this period of the population crash is that some people are going to do much better than others, and so most people are not going to make it. And then what's going to happen then is this period of adaptation where all of a sudden now people are changing dramatically the way that they live. Instead of just going to the grocery store for food, they're having to fish for food. They're growing beans and things that they're going to need to survive. And so the way that people are living here, the skills that they're learning as children, the things that they're doing as adults, very different than the way that people are living here. Now, why do we do this this kind of thought experiment? Well, there's really, the main reason is that I want us to realize that one of the things that's challenging sometimes with understanding how evolution works is that automatically people start thinking about humans evolving. And the problem with that is that humans live, the world that we live in is so foreign to the natural world. When we're hungry, what do? We go to the refrigerator. If the refrigerator's out, we decide if we want to, go to a restaurant or go to Vaughn's and pick up food. None of us really, go through life worrying about being killed and eaten by something. So humans live in this very sheltered, very non-natural world, and so then trying to discuss, the problems of surviving in the natural world, which essentially boil down to avoid becoming food, find enough food for yourself, and if you find enough food for yourself, hopefully you find a little extra that you can actually then support having offspring. And so this kind of thought experiment helps us to sort of picture the problems of surviving in the natural world that humans, rarely face in our society. Also, one other thing I want you to think about with these adaptations, I want to make a little note here. The adaptations, they might be physical in some way, but there's also going to be lots of behavioral adaptations, right? Changing the way that we raise our children, for example, and the skills that we teach them, that'd be a behavioral adaptation. So one of the things that Darwin realized was that not all living things are created equal, that in the struggle to survive, some competitors are going to be better equipped to survive in different environments than others. And I like this picture because this would be Mr. Boss in that scenario, right? Without my glasses, I'm blind. And without being able to see, you're going to fall prey to some manner of ill fate awaits you if you can't see, right? Being able to see is pretty important for human beings when it comes to actually surviving in the wild, right? And so I would not be very well equipped. Not being able to see is going to put me at a huge disadvantage compared to everybody else that can see just fine. So that was one of the things that Darwin realized was like, look, these different organisms that are born, some of them are going to have phenotypes that are very good for survival and some not so much. So what did Darwin generate as his hypothesis, which we now treat that hypothesis has now been treated as a theory. So his hypothesis was that you can actually generate new species through changes in an older species over time. Can I make a little note here? We're talking about long periods of time, very long, based on the survival of those individuals under different conditions. So he essentially, looked at the fact that humans have been changing dogs through artificial selection. We looked at some examples of artificial selection in the last unit, right? And he said, look, if humans can change dogs so dramatically just by deciding who gets to breed, then he thought that maybe nature could do the same thing. And so remember, selective breeding, we looked at some examples last time, dogs, the different dog breeds that humans have created. We did that through artificial selection. The different cow breeds are another example of artificial selection. The fact that we have seedless fruit, and there was a whole myriad of examples I gave you in the last one, right? So just think about pretty much any domesticated animal or plant that you can think of, great example of artificial selection. So what Darwin came up with was this idea of natural selection, the idea that instead of humans choosing who gets to breed, that nature gets to choose who gets to breed. And then he's thought that evolution, this idea of that organisms can change over time, was caused essentially by mutations and natural selection. One thing I want you to understand and should make a note on is that mutations are random and natural selection is actually not random. So sometimes people will say something like, oh, evolution thinks that evolution says that different species can appear just at random, and it's like, well, not exactly. There is a random component to evolution, which is that the mutations that occur in the DNA appear to be, fairly random. But natural selection is anything but random. Natural selection is the idea that nature is going to decide, who gets to survive and reproduce, and then who doesn't. And so that's not really random at all. That's actually it's not necessarily directed in a particular direction. It's not like evolution is saying, okay, I want to create, taller things or shorter things, whatever. It's just that this selective pressure can be very directional in one particular direction. And again, this is over time, over many generations. And I want you to add something else. Because remember, I'm trying to give you the evolutionary theory and the evidence that supports it, but I'm also trying to tell you kind of where, if you want to disagree with evolution, where most people do disagree with it. And so I want you to kind of make a little note, maybe up here above these two, that this one, if you're going to attack evolution, if you don't want to believe in evolution, you really can't touch this one. Natural selection is about as rock solid as anything can be, and we'll see some examples as we go through this unit, but you really can't argue with natural selection. We've seen it. It makes total sense logically. This is the part that if you want to attack evolution, you got to go for here. Remember, the idea essentially is that mutations make new things, new phenotypes, and those new phenotypes are then selected by natural selection. And again, this part's rock solid, but over here, you can argue that perhaps mutations can't make really new, interesting phenotypes and make big changes. Remember that if you think about what his definition of evolution is, it's that you can make new species. And again, the question is, can it make new kinds? Can you go from amphibians to reptiles, from reptiles to birds, and from reptiles to mammals? Like those big changes, is evolution capable of making those really big changes over time? So what natural selection says is the idea that organisms that have favorable genes for an environment will tend to survive and also breed more successfully. And so then logically, if you think about kind of maybe add to your notes here, that means the next generation is going to look more like them. Why is it going to look more like them? Well, because they bred more, and so the next generation is going to have more organisms look like them. In other words, environmental pressures like the food that's available, the kind of predators that are around, and niche space can all select for favorable genes. Niche space essentially, like think of a niche as like the business card of an organism. So like what does it do? If there's a lot of competition there, that can be a selective pressure too. So let's look at this organism here, the alligator. Let's think about the shape of the head of the alligator. It is very differently shaped than ours, yeah? Where are the eyes? Well, they're on the very top of the head. Where are the nostrils? They're also on the top of the head. What's the purpose of that? Well, it allows for the alligator to be able to kind of poke its head just barely out of the water, be able to sit there and breathe, be able to see, but the vast majority of his head is way underwater, and the vast majority of his body is underwater, and so he can hide very effectively. Let's pretend that in a generation of alligators, there's an alligator that had a head that was more shaped like this, where the eye was further down on the side of the head and maybe the nostrils were further down as well. Well, these would be genes creating very unfavorable phenotypes. And the reason why, well, this alligator is going to have to stick his head further out of the water, and so he's going to have a bigger profile. He or she is going to have a bigger profile and be much more visible. Organisms are going to be able to see a lot more of him. And so he's not going to be able to sneak up and, devour the prey that he needs to. He's not going to be very well adapted at being an ambush predator. And so as a result, this individual with this phenotype, not very favorable, not probably going to survive, or if they do survive, not very well, and probably won't be able to have the extra energy needed to breed. And so this phenotype would be selected against. And so in the next generation, you're not going to see many that have that shape because it wasn't a very good shape for surviving as an alligator. So that's what natural selection essentially is. We'll look at some more examples as we go through. Mutation, we know what mutation is. It's simply an error in the DNA. It's a change in the DNA that causes the DNA, that sequence change. And it can result potentially in new phenotypes. That's the idea. When it comes to evolution, a good description of it is the idea that you get genetic mutations that give rise to new traits, and then natural selection acts on those traits continuously, selecting for traits that increase reproductive success and survival, and weeding out the ones that don't. And I mentioned earlier that natural selection is really pretty unassailable. Natural selection is basically rock solid as anything that we can get. But if you want to attack evolution, the kind of the most logical place to try to poke holes in it is this idea of mutations. And the reason why the mutation part is kind of tricky is that what evolution says that mutations make the new things, right, the new traits, and then natural selection acts on them. Well, mutations, for the most part, that we see in the world today, they don't give rise to new, better traits. They silence proteins, they turn proteins off, they alter the shape and the function of the protein, they can even cause cancer and possibly kill the organism. And so that's where there is definitely still some ground to be covered with evolutionary theory as far as how do these mutations actually accumulate that are positive mutations. I've shown you tons of examples of mutations that are negative, right? You take the gene for making human hemoglobin, and just one amino acid change in the 7th position is what gives us a valine instead of a glutamate in the protein, and that actually causes the sickle cell, red blood cell. So, most of the examples that you can look up and you can find for mutations are mutations that turn off a protein. And, the question is, can you get mutations that actually make new features, new traits? Now on to a term that's very misunderstood in evolution is this idea of fitness. You might have heard the idea that, evolution is the survival of the fittest. That's a common term that people use. But they'll use it not really understanding what fitness means. Because when we think of fitness, a lot of times we think of physical fitness, like the strongest or the smartest or the one that's able to get the food the best or whatever it might be, right? That's able to outcompete all of its competitors. But it's really none of those things. Fitness, by definition, is simply the ability to produce offsprings. So the more offspring, the more fit you are. It's that simple. And so I use this picture right here. This is a picture of a woman named Nadia Suleiman, who the tabloid, she was in the news a while ago. You may not remember her, but in the tabloid, she's kind of derogatorily referred to as Octomom. And the reason she has that name was that she actually purposefully went to an in vitro clinic and was impregnated with way too many embryos and on purpose. And actually gave birth to 8 children at once, and she did that because she wanted essentially to become famous, sort of like John and Kate plus 8 kind of a situation. She thought maybe she'd get her own reality TV show and be famous. Well, it didn't turn out that way. She kind of became more of the villain in the popular culture. And those 8 kids that she had actually were, I forget the number, but she ended up, they were the 15th and 16th kid. She has a ton of kids, way more than Mr. Boss. And Mr. Boss has 2. Might be having a 3rd at some point in the future, but that's it probably for me. And so her fitness is way better than Mr. Boss's fitness. The next generation of Californians is going to have more of her DNA and less of mine. She's leaving behind because she's leaving behind more offspring. She's more fit. The next generation of Californians is going to have more of her chromosomes in it than Mr. Boss chromosomes, and so forth. And so you can imagine generation after generation. That's how populations can shift. That's the idea. So Darwin came up with his idea of natural selection. He looked at what humans had done with dogs and artificial selection, and he said, why can't nature do the same thing? And he came up with essentially the mechanism by which it works, and it breaks down into these 4 principles. And like I've said before, natural selection is really pretty airtight, and I think you'll understand as we go through these 4 principles how common sense they are. So let's look at the first one. So organisms will have more offspring than can survive on available resources. So if you have a hard time wrapping your head around that one, just think about a big grass field with rabbits in it, and there's nothing to eat the rabbits. Okay, so there's no foxes or anything to kill the rabbits, plenty of food initially for the rabbits, but what's going to happen over time? Well, those rabbits are going to reproduce and reproduce and reproduce until eventually you're going to get more offspring than can survive on available resources. This is just a trend that we see in nature. So there's going to be some kind of competition. If I want to make a little note next to that, there's going to be some kind of competition. Maybe it's for finding enough food, could be avoiding predation, but there's going to be some form of competition going on. Individuals in a population show variation. So that's just a fact of reality. I mean, if you think about any population you want to think of. Let's think of humans, just because it's one we're familiar with. Think about the classroom that you're sitting in when you go to school. Look around. The students are different. They're different genders. They're different heights and weights and hair color and eye color and all those kind of things that we can just sort of visually see, right? Body type, how large and small they are. But you can also think of all the variations that you can't see that are more important, all the genetic variations, right? How one student might have a gene that leads to this thing, or, there's all these different variations. And that's true even within think about a smaller population, like even your family. This goes with this one, that variations can be inherited. So Even in your family, there's variation between you and your siblings. But what's interesting is these variations can be inherited. In other words, maybe your parents are very short. And so as a result, likely their children are going to be short. And that's because those variations, I'm going to make a little note here, these are variations that are caused by genes. And so the genes are passed down from generation to generation. The next one, and this is sort of the big kind of like, all this is sort of the laying the groundwork. And then here's the big one. Variations or traits that increase your reproductive success will have a greater chance of being passed on to the next generation. That's very common sense when you think about it. If the traits that you have as an individual allow you to survive and reproduce a lot, well, those traits, those genes that made you that way, well, they're going to be shown a lot in the next generation. Why? Because you reproduced a lot. And if you've got traits, if you've got genes that code for variations that aren't super good at surviving and producing a lot of offspring, well, they're not going to be expressed very much in the next generation because you didn't leave behind very many offspring. This diagram a lot because I think it really simplifies and explains how natural selection works in a very visual way. So you've got a population that's growing. Maybe let's use in this example birds on an island of the Galapagos. Okay? You've got competition for resources. So make a note next to that. That could be for food. It could be for predation. It could be for space, like living space. And then you've got reproductive successes and failures based on the different phenotypes in the environment. So let's flesh that example out. We've got birds living on the Galapagos. Maybe there's tons of food and there's nothing to eat them. But this particular species of birds, well, they want to build their nests up in a cactus. Because while there's nothing around that's going to eat the birds, there are things that might eat the eggs. Well, there's only a certain number of cacti on the island to lay the nests in. There's your competition for resources. They're competing for who can get the best nest space. And so maybe those competitions are violent and the largest, strongest birds win. So you've got your reproductive successes and failures. So the largest, strongest birds are successful. They have the safest nest. They're going to leave lots of offspring, lots of their genes for being large and strong. And the birds that are smaller and maybe not as aggressive, they fail. They don't pass on their genes as much. And so think about what's the next generation of birds going to look like. They're going to be, in general, larger and stronger. And that's just going to cycle through again and again and again. That's how natural selection is thought to work. In the next video, I'll be showing you lots of examples of how we've seen natural selection shape populations that we've actually been able to observe, which is kind of cool. And I hope that video was helpful, and I'll see you next time.